Sometimes the loneliest people are the ones who stand tallest in a crowd. Sometimes the strongest hearts belong to those who've learned to live without expecting love to find them. In the small town of Dry Creek, Flint Rawley was 8 feet of pure muscle and stubborn pride. Everyone knew his strength, but nobody knew his gentle heart. Miss Agnes Truelight was the town schoolteacher, quiet, smart, and completely uninterested in the giant cowboy who could wrestle bulls. She had her books and her classroom. He had his ranch and his reputation. Neither expected their worlds to collide on one stormy night that changed everything. When Agnes shows up at his door, months later with life-changing news, Flint faces the biggest challenge of his life. What happens when a man who never knew his father discovers he's about to become one? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun crested over the rolling hills of Dry Creek, casting long shadows across a town that had seen better days. Once a thriving cattle hub where fortunes were made and lost with the changing seasons, it now held perhaps 300 souls who stubbornly refused to follow the railroad east to bigger opportunities. The main street stretched barely 4 blocks, lined with weathered storefronts that had survived countless prairie storms and the slow exodus of dreams. At the far end of town, where the last house gave way to endless grassland, stood the Rawley, a ranch. It wasn't the biggest spread in the territory, but it was well kept and profitable enough to support one man and his simple needs. That man was Flint Rawley, and he was already 3 hours into his workday by the time most folks were stirring their coffee. Flint stood in the corral, his massive frame silhouetted against the dawn sky, working with a young stallion that had been giving him trouble for weeks. At 8 feet tall in his worn leather boots, he was a sight that still made newcomers stop and stare. His shoulders were broad enough to block a doorway, his hands large enough to palm a man's head like a melon. But those who knew him well, and there weren't many, understood that beneath all that imposing muscle beat the heart of a gentle giant. The stallion reared and snorted, dancing away from the lead rope. Flint moved with surprising grace for such a large man, speaking in low, soothing tones that seemed to calm the animal's nervous energy. "Easy there, Thunder. Nobody's looking to hurt you," he murmured, his voice carrying the kind of patience that came from years of working with skittish creatures, both animal and human. In his back pocket, wrapped carefully in oiled leather, Flint carried a small wooden horse he'd carved as a boy. His mother had taught him to whittle during the long winter evenings when the wind howled across the plains and there was little else to do. The little toy was crude by adult standards, but it represented something precious to him. Proof that his large, seemingly clumsy hands could create something beautiful and gentle. Flint had been 10 when his mother told him the truth about his father. The man had taken one look at his oversized infant son and decided he wanted no part of raising what he called a freak of nature. It was a wound that had never fully healed, though Flint had learned to carry it quietly. He'd spent his childhood watching other boys with their fathers, learning to fish and hunt and work the land together. He'd learned those skills on his own, through trial and error, with only his mother's encouragement to guide him. Sarah Rawley had been a small woman, with a fierce spirit, barely reaching her son's chest even when he was 15. She'd worked herself to the bone keeping the ranch going after her husband left, and she'd raised Flint to be respectful, hard-working, and kind. When she died of pneumonia 5 winters ago, she'd made him promise to find someone to share his life with. "You've got too much love in you to waste it on just the animals," she'd whispered with her last breath. "Promise me you'll try to find a good woman who can see past that mountain of muscle to the gentle soul underneath." Flint had promised, but keeping that promise had proven more difficult than breaking wild horses. Most women in Dry Creek were either already married, too young, or frankly intimidated by his size. The few who'd shown interest seemed more fascinated by his unusual stature than genuinely attracted to him as a person. He'd had a few brief courtships over the years, but nothing that felt real or lasting. At 32, he'd resigned himself to bachelorhood. He had his ranch, his animals, and the respect of the community. It was enough, he told himself. It had to be. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Miss Agnes Truelight was preparing for another day in her one-room schoolhouse. At 43, she was what polite society called a spinster, though that term hardly did justice to the complex woman who had shaped young minds in Dry Creek for the past 8 years. Agnes had arrived in town as a young widow, her husband having died of consumption just 2 years into their marriage. She'd been 28 then, still young enough to remarry and start a family, but something in her had closed off after Robert's death. Perhaps it was the way his illness had drained their small savings, or the way his family had blamed her for not taking better care of him. Whatever the reason, she'd thrown herself into teaching with the dedication of someone who had no other outlet for her nurturing instincts. The schoolhouse was her domain, and she ruled it with gentle authority. Her students ranged in age from 6 to 14, the children of farmers, shopkeepers, and the few remaining ranch hands who still called Dry Creek home. She taught them reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography, but more importantly, she taught them to think, to question, and to dream beyond the limited horizons of their small town. This morning, Agnes stood before her small mirror, pinning her graying brown hair into its customary neat bun. She'd been beautiful once, still was, in the eyes of those who looked closely enough to see past the severe hairstyles and practical dresses. Her eyes were a warm hazel that could sparkle with humor or flash with indignation, depending on the situation. Her hands were slender but strong, equally comfortable, holding a piece of chalk or binding a child's scraped knee. In her bedroom dresser, wrapped in tissue paper, lay her most treasured possession, a silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother. Inside was a tiny photograph of her late husband, Robert. For 15 years she'd worn it every day, a tangible reminder of the love she'd lost. Lately, though, she'd found herself leaving it in the drawer more often than not. Not because she'd forgotten Robert, but because she was tired of wearing her grief like a badge of honor. Agnes had heard the stories about Flint Rawley, of course. In a town the size of Dry Creek, everyone knew everyone else's business. She knew he was decent and hard-working, that he'd never caused trouble or treated anyone poorly. She also knew that most people saw him as something of a curiosity, the gentle giant who could lift a full-grown steer, but had never so much as raised his voice in anger. Their paths had crossed occasionally over the years. He'd tip his hat politely when they passed on the street, and she'd nod in acknowledgement. Once, when her schoolhouse roof had been damaged in a spring storm, he'd arrived with his tools and materials and spent 2 days repairing it, refusing any payment beyond a jar of her homemade preserves. "Seems wrong to let the children's learning suffer on account of a leaky roof," he'd said simply, his deep voice barely above a whisper, as if he were afraid his words might carry too much weight. Agnes had watched him work from her classroom window, noting the careful precision with which he handled even the smallest tasks. His massive hands had somehow managed delicate repairs that would have challenged men half his size. There was something almost artistic in the way he worked, she'd thought, though she'd quickly dismissed such fanciful notions. The truth was, Agnes Truelight had spent so many years convincing herself that she was content with her solitary life that she'd almost started to believe it. She had her students, her books, her small garden behind the schoolhouse. She attended church on Sundays, helped with community socials, and maintained cordial relationships with the other women in town. It was a good life, a respectable life, but sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, she'd lie in her narrow bed and wonder what it might be like to have someone to share her thoughts with, someone who could appreciate the way morning light slanted through her kitchen window, or understand why she found such joy in watching her students master a difficult concept. She'd certainly never imagined that someone might be the intimidating cowboy who lived at the edge of town. Flint Rawley was everything she wasn't. Large where she was small, physical where she was intellectual, rough around the edges where she was refined. They moved in the same small community, but inhabited completely different worlds. As Agnes gathered her lesson plans for the day, she couldn't know that their separate worlds were about to collide in ways that would change both their lives forever. The seeds of that collision had already been planted in the growing concern for old Dr. Henderson, whose hands had started shaking badly enough that folks were beginning to whisper about what would happen when the town's only medical help finally gave in to age. Winter was coming early to Dry Creek, and with it would come challenges that would test everyone's assumptions about themselves and each other. The comfortable distance that Agnes and Flint had maintained for years was about to become impossible to sustain. For now, though, they continued their separate routines. He with his horses and cattle, she with her books and students, neither. Realizing that fate was already weaving their stories together with threads as strong as the prairie wind and as inevitable as the changing seasons. The first blizzard of the season struck Dry Creek with a vengeance that caught everyone unprepared. Dr. Henderson had been making his rounds when the storm hit, trying to reach the Morrison farm where their youngest had come down with a fever. The old physician's horse was found the next morning, wandering riderless near the creek. They found Dr. Henderson 3 hours later, frozen solid beneath a cottonwood tree, his medical bag clutched in his stiff fingers. The funeral was held 2 days later, when the storm finally broke. Half the town turned out to pay their respects to the man who had delivered most of their children and tended their ailments for over 30 years. As the preacher spoke about service and sacrifice, a grim reality settled over the mourners. They were now a town without a doctor, with winter bearing down hard and the nearest medical help 2 days' ride away. Agnes stood at the graveside, her black wool coat pulled tight against the bitter wind. She'd known Dr. Henderson well. He'd been one of the few people in town who treated her as an intellectual equal, often stopping by the schoolhouse to discuss the medical journals he received from back east. In their conversations, she'd absorbed more knowledge about healing than she'd realized. "What are we going to do?" whispered Martha Collins, the blacksmith's wife, standing beside Agnes. "My youngest has been coughing something fierce, and with this weather—" Agnes found herself speaking before she'd fully formed the thought. "I could help," she said quietly. "Dr. Henderson taught me quite a bit about basic care. I'm no replacement for a real physician, but I know about setting bones and treating fevers." Word spread quickly through the small crowd. By the time they'd returned to town, it was understood that Miss Agnes Truelight would serve as their temporary medical help until they could find a proper doctor, though everyone knew that might be spring at the earliest. That evening, Agnes sat in her small parlor examining Dr. Henderson's medical bag. The leather was worn smooth from decades of use, and inside she found instruments and supplies that would have to last through winter. She'd inherited more than just medical tools. She'd inherited the responsibility for keeping her community healthy and alive. It was 3 weeks later when fate brought Agnes and Flint together in a way that would change both their lives forever. Flint had been working with a particularly ornery Mustang that morning, a wild-caught mare with fire in her eyes and steel springs for legs. He'd been making good progress with her over the past few days, but the approaching storm had made all the animals restless. He should have quit for the day when the wind started picking up, but stubborn pride kept him in the corral. The mare reared without warning, her hooves catching Flint square in the chest and sending his massive frame crashing into the fence rails. The impact shattered 2 of the wooden posts and left Flint sprawled in the dirt, struggling to breathe. His left arm hung at an odd angle, and blood seeped through his shirt where the splintered wood had gouged deep. Thunder rumbled overhead as Flint managed to pull himself upright, his vision swimming. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and with the storm coming, there was no chance of getting help. He stumbled toward the house, each step sending waves of pain through his ribs. He'd nearly reached the front porch when he saw the light, a lantern bobbing through the gathering darkness, moving steadily toward his ranch. As the figure drew closer, he recognized the slight form of Agnes Truelight, her medical bag slung over her shoulder and her dark cloak whipping in the wind. "Mr. Rawley!" she called out, quickening her pace when she saw him swaying on his feet. "Martha Collins saw the accident from the road. She sent me—" "Miss Truelight," Flint managed, his voice strained. "Shouldn't have come out in this weather. Storm's going to be a bad one." Agnes reached him just as his knees buckled, her small and surprisingly strong as she steadied his enormous frame. "Let's get you inside before we both freeze," she said practically, though her heart was racing at the contact. Getting Flint into the house proved challenging. Even with his help, Agnes could barely manage to guide his injured bulk through this doorway. The interior of his cabin surprised her with its cleanliness and simple comfort. Hand-carved furniture filled the main room, and the stone fireplace was already laid with kindling. "Sit here," Agnes instructed, helping him onto a sturdy wooden chair. "Let me light the fire first, then I'll have a look at that arm." As she worked to get the fire started, Flint watched her with growing amazement. There was no hesitation in her movements, no squeamishness about the blood or his obvious pain. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to taking charge in difficult situations. "This is going to hurt," she warned as she began cutting away his shirt. Her fingers were gentle but thorough as she examined the damage. "The arm is definitely broken, but it's a clean break. These cuts will need stitching, but they're not too deep." Outside, the storm was intensifying. Wind howled around the cabin, and snow began pelting the windows with increasing force. Agnes glanced toward the door, then back at Flint's injuries. "I'm afraid we're going to be here for a while," she said, settling into her work. "This storm's not going to let up any time soon." For the next 2 hours, Agnes worked with careful precision, setting Flint's arm and stitching his wounds while he gritted his teeth and tried not to think about how small and capable her hands looked against his damaged skin. She'd found his whiskey and insisted he drink several swallows for the pain, though she refused any herself. "There," she said finally, wrapping the last bandage around his ribs. "You'll be sore for weeks, but everything should heal properly if you're careful." Flint flexed his fingers experimentally, marveling at the skill of her work. "I owe you a debt I can't repay," he said quietly. "If you hadn't come—" "Nonsense," Agnes interrupted, though she was blushing slightly. "It's what Dr. Henderson would have done." The storm raged on through the night, making travel impossible. Agnes tried to make herself comfortable in the chair by the fire, but Flint wouldn't hear of it. "Take the bed," he insisted. "I'll sleep on the floor by the fire. Mr. Rawley, you're injured." "Flint," he corrected gently, "and I've slept in worse places than this floor. Besides, my mother would tan my hide if she knew I let a lady sleep in a chair." Something in his voice, a mixture of pain and loneliness that had nothing to do with his physical injuries, made Agnes look at him more closely. In the firelight, his harsh features seemed softer, more vulnerable. For the first time, she saw, past his intimidating size, to the gentle man underneath. They talked through the night, sharing stories and discovering surprising common ground. Flint spoke about his mother's death and the loneliness of working the ranch alone. Agnes found herself telling him about her marriage to Robert, about the dreams they'd shared, and the emptiness she'd felt since his death. As dawn approached and the storm finally began to weaken, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low. Agnes had removed her silver locket sometime during the night, setting it absently on the small table beside her chair. For the first time in 15 years, she felt truly at peace in a man's presence. "I should go," she said finally, though she made no move to rise. "People will talk if they know I spent the night here." "Let them talk," Flint said, his deep voice roughened by whiskey and exhaustion. "You saved my life tonight, Agnes. Nothing else matters." The use of her first name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. In the growing light of dawn, with his shirt torn away and his dark hair mussed from sleep, Flint Rawley looked less like the intimidating giant of local legend and more like a man who needed someone to care for him. When she finally left, after the storm had passed and the roads were barely passable, Agnes carried with her the memory of gentle hands that could carve delicate wooden toys and a voice that could soothe frightened animals. She also carried the beginning of something she'd thought was buried forever, the stirring of feelings she'd convinced herself she was too old to experience again. Neither of them spoke of the night they'd shared, but something fundamental had changed between them. A bridge had been built across the careful distance they'd maintained for years, and there would be no going back to the way things were before. 3 weeks had passed since the storm, and Agnes was discovering that avoiding someone in a town the size of Dry Creek required considerable effort. She'd changed her route to the schoolhouse twice, started shopping at different times, and even considered taking her meals at home instead of occasionally eating at the boarding house, all to avoid the uncomfortable flutter in her chest whenever she caught sight of Flint's towering figure moving through town. It wasn't working very well. That morning, as she stood before her classroom teaching the Peterson children about the capital cities of the eastern states, Agnes felt the familiar queasiness that had been plaguing her for days. She'd attributed it to nerves. The aftermath of that intimate night in Flint's cabin had left her emotionally unsettled in ways she was struggling to understand. "Miss Truelight?" Young Sally Peterson raised her hand. "Are you feeling poorly? You look a bit green around the gills." Agnes forced a smile and pressed her hand to her stomach. "I'm fine, dear. Just a touch of something. Now, can anyone tell me the capital of Virginia?" But she wasn't fine, and as the days passed, the queasiness was joined by a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to cure. She told herself it was the stress of her new medical responsibilities. She'd been called out to treat everything from broken bones to childhood fevers since Dr. Henderson's death. The whole town was depending on her now, and the weight of that responsibility was bound to take its toll. It was Martha Collins who finally forced her to face the truth she'd been trying to ignore. "Agnes Truelight, you sit yourself down this instant," Martha commanded, finding Agnes swaying slightly as she tried to organize supplies in the makeshift clinic she'd set up in the back room of the schoolhouse. "When's the last time you had your monthly courses?" The blunt question hit Agnes like a physical blow. She sank into the nearest chair, her mind racing backward through recent weeks. The storm, the night with Flint, the growing symptoms she'd been trying to rationalize away. "That's impossible," she whispered, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't. "I'm 43 years old, Martha. Women my age don't just what?" Martha's expression was knowing and not unsympathetic. "Get pregnant? Honey, my own sister had her last baby at 45. Nature doesn't always follow our expectations." Agnes felt the world tilt around her. Pregnant, at her age, unmarried, after one night of weakness with a man she barely knew, a man the entire town would assume had taken advantage of the respectable schoolteacher. Her reputation would be ruined. She'd lose her position, her home, everything she'd built for herself. "What am I going to do?" The words escaped as barely a whisper. Martha's weathered hand covered hers. "First thing is to be sure. I know a woman over in Cedar Falls who can tell you for certain. It's a day's ride, but with this weather breaking, we could make it there and back before anyone notices you're gone." Meanwhile, Flint was throwing himself into ranch work with a desperation that worried his animals. He'd spent the past 3 weeks trying to forget the feel of Agnes's gentle hands on his skin, the sound of her voice in the darkness, the way she'd looked at him in the firelight, not with fear or pity, but with something that might have been affection. He'd always known he was different, set apart by his size and the circumstances of his birth. Most people treated him with respect, but it was the careful respect one might show a dangerous animal, polite but distant. Agnes had been different that night. She'd touched him without flinching, had talked to him like he was just a man instead of a curiosity, and then she'd started avoiding him like he carried the plague. "You're going to work yourself into an early grave," his elderly neighbor Pete Morrison observed as he watched Flint single-handedly repair an entire section of fence that would normally require 3 men. "What's got you so fired up?" Flint straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool autumn air. "Just trying to get things ready for winter." Pete's knowing chuckle suggested he wasn't buying that explanation. "This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain school teacher, would it? Town's been buzzing about how she tended your injuries during that storm." "Miss Truelight was being neighborly," Flint said carefully. "Nothing more to it than that." "If you say so," Pete replied, but his tone suggested he thought there was considerably more to it. "Though I will say, it's about time someone saw past all that muscle to the good man underneath. Your mother, God rest her soul, always said you had too much love in you to waste it on just the animals." The mention of his mother's words, the promise he'd made to her on her deathbed, sent a fresh wave of longing through Flint's chest. For a brief moment that night with Agnes, he'd allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to have someone to share his life with. Someone who could see him as more than just the town's gentle giant. But Agnes's subsequent avoidance had made it clear that whatever he'd imagined between them had been one-sided. She was educated, refined, respectable, everything he wasn't. That night had been an aberration, a moment of proximity brought on by emergency and storm, nothing more. That evening, as Flint sat alone in his cabin carving another small wooden horse, a habit that always calmed his mind, he found himself thinking about his father, the man who'd taken one look at his oversized infant son and decided he wanted no part of raising what he'd called a freak of nature. For 32 years, Flint had carried the wound of that abandonment. It had shaped every interaction he'd had with women, every moment of self-doubt about whether he was meant to be alone. His mother had tried to heal that wound with love and acceptance, but some hurts ran too deep to be easily mended. Now, as he sat in the growing darkness with only his carving knife and his memories for company, Flint wondered if he'd been foolish to hope for anything different. Maybe some men were meant to live alone. Maybe that night with Agnes had been his one taste of something deeper, and he should be grateful for it, instead of longing for more. Across town, Agnes lay awake in her narrow bed, one hand pressed protectively to her stomach. The trip to Cedar Falls had confirmed what she'd already known in her heart. She was carrying Flint Rawley's child. At 43, she was pregnant for the first time in her life, unmarried and facing social ruin. On her nightstand, her silver locket caught, the moonlight streaming through her window. For 15 years, she'd worn Robert's image close to her heart, a talisman against loneliness and the possibility of loving again. Tonight, for the first time since his death, she'd removed it entirely, whatever happened next, whatever consequences. She'd have to face. Agnes knew her life had been irrevocably changed by one storm-bound night with a gentle giant who carved wooden horses and spoke to animals in whispers. The question now was whether she had the courage to tell him, and whether either of them could survive what came after. The leather-bound journal had been a gift from her students the previous Christmas, and Agnes had barely touched it until now. But sitting at her kitchen table, in the pre-dawn darkness, with a cup of chamomile tea growing cold beside her, she found herself writing with desperate honesty about thoughts she'd never dared speak aloud. November 15th, 1884. I am with child. At 43 years of age, after believing myself beyond such possibilities, I am carrying the baby of a man I barely know yet somehow trust completely. The irony is not lost on me. I, who have taught countless children about proper behavior and moral conduct, I, who have lectured young ladies about the importance of virtue and reputation, find myself in precisely the situation I've warned others to avoid, and yet I cannot bring myself to feel the shame I know I should. When I think of Flint, and I think of him far more often than is proper. I remember not the scandal of our joining, but the gentleness in his hands as he carved that little wooden horse he carries, the way his voice could calm frightened animals, the vulnerability in his eyes when he spoke of his mother. What terrifies me most is not the judgment of this town or the loss of my position, but the possibility that he will see this child as a burden, a trap, laid by a desperate spinster. He deserves better than that, and perhaps the child does too. Agnes set down her pen and pressed her hand to her stomach, where a tiny life was growing. A life that would need a father, deserved a father, especially one as gentle and strong as Flint Rawley. The decision had been building in her mind for days now, and this morning she finally had the courage to act on it. She dressed carefully in her best blue dress, not because she thought it mattered, but because having confidence in her appearance might help her find the words she needed. The ride to Flint's ranch took 20 minutes, 20 minutes during which she rehearsed a dozen different ways to tell him the news and discarded each one as inadequate. Flint was in the barn when she arrived, mucking stalls with the methodical thoroughness that characterized everything he did. The sight of him, sleeves rolled up, dark hair falling across his forehead, moving with that surprising grace despite his enormous frame, made her heart skip in ways that had nothing to do with nervousness. "Agnes," he said, straightening when he saw her. His voice held warmth but also uncertainty, as if he wasn't sure of his welcome. "Is someone hurt? Do you need—" "No," she interrupted quickly. "No one's hurt. I came to speak with you about something else entirely." She watched his expression shift from concern to wariness, and her heart sank. Already he was preparing to be disappointed, to have his worst assumptions confirmed. It was a look she recognized, the expression of a man who'd learned not to expect. "Good things, Flint," she began, then stopped, struck by how strange it felt to use his first name in daylight, in his own barn, with full awareness of what they'd shared and what had resulted from it. "I have something important to tell you, and I need you to listen without saying anything until I'm finished." He nodded slowly, setting aside his pitchfork and giving her his complete attention. In the morning light streaming through the barn doors, she could see the fading marks from his injuries, the careful way he favored his left arm. She'd done that. She'd healed him, touched him, brought him comfort. Whatever else happened, she would always have that memory. "I'm pregnant," she said simply, watching his face for any sign of his reaction. "It happened that night during the storm. I know this complicates everything, and I know it's not what either of us planned or expected. I've been trying to decide what to do, how to handle this situation, and I finally realized that you deserve to know. You deserve to have a say in what happens next." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle sounds of horses shifting in their stalls. Flint's expression had gone completely blank, his dark eyes unreadable. Agnes found herself holding her breath, waiting for condemnation or rejection or angry accusations about her motives. Instead, he sank slowly onto a nearby hay bale, his massive frame suddenly looking somehow diminished. "Are you certain?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes," Agnes replied, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to stop them from trembling. "I consulted with a woman in Cedar Falls who confirmed it. There's no doubt." Flint stared at the barn floor for a long moment, and Agnes felt her heart breaking a little more with each second of silence. She'd known this was a risk, that he might see the pregnancy as an attempt to trap him, to force marriage with a woman he'd barely looked at before that storm-bound night. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a complexity of emotions she couldn't entirely read. "What do you want from me, Agnes? What do you expect me to do?" The question hurt more than she'd anticipated. "I don't want anything from you," she said, lifting her chin with as much dignity as she could manage. "I thought you had a right to—" "No, that's all. I can manage on my own. I've been doing it for years." "That's not what I meant," Flint said quickly, rising from the hay bale and taking a step toward her. "I didn't mean—" "Agnes, I need to know what you want. Whether you want—" This child, whether you want—" He struggled with the words, his face flushing slightly. "Whether you'd consider marriage, for the child's sake, for the child's sake." The words hit her like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears. He was offering marriage as a duty, a responsibility, not because he had any real feelings for her. Agnes had dreamed of marriage proposals during her younger years, but never one that felt so much like a business transaction. "I appreciate the offer," she said stiffly, "but I won't trap you into a marriage you don't want. The child and I will manage perfectly well without—" "Stop," Flint interrupted, his voice sharp enough to make her look at him in surprise. "Just stop talking about trapping and managing and doing things alone. That's not—" He ran his hands through his hair, clearly struggling to find the right words. "Agnes, I've been alone my whole life. I never thought I'd have a family. Never. Thought any woman would want to build a life with someone like me? Someone like you. You know what I mean." His gesture encompassed his intimidating height, his massive frame. "I'm not exactly what most women dream of when they think about husbands, but this child, our child, deserves better than growing up without a father. I know what that's like, and I won't let it happen to my son or daughter." Agnes felt tears pricking at her eyes, though whether from disappointment or relief, she couldn't say. "So you're proposing marriage out of duty?" "I'm proposing marriage because it's the right thing to do," Flint said firmly, "for all of us. We're both adults, Agnes. We both know this situation isn't ideal, but we can make the best of it. I'll be a good husband to you and a good father. To the child, I promise you that." It wasn't the romantic proposal she'd once dreamed of, but it was honest and practical and offered security for both her and the baby. Agnes found herself nodding before she'd fully processed the decision. "All right," she said quietly, "for the child's sake." Neither of them mentioned love, though both were thinking about it, Agnes with regret for what this arrangement lacked, and Flint with hope that perhaps, given time, duty might grow into something deeper. They were both too proud and too hurt to risk vulnerability, so they sealed their agreement with handshakes and careful formality, building the foundation of a marriage on practicality rather than passion. It would have to be enough. For now, it would have to be enough. The wedding dress had belonged to Flint's mother, carefully preserved in tissue paper and cedar chips for over 30 years. When Sarah Rawley had married Flint's father in 1850, the cream-colored silk had been the finest thing she'd ever owned. Now, as Agnes stood before the mirror in the back room of the church, adjusting the fitted bodice that had required only minor alterations, she felt the weight of history and hope that the dress carried. "You look beautiful, dear," said Mrs. Patterson, the pastor's wife, as she made final adjustments to the simple veil. Flint's mother would be so pleased to see her dress worn again, especially for such a joyous occasion. Agnes nodded, though joy wasn't exactly what she was feeling. Nervous anticipation, certainly. Relief that she and the baby would have security and respectability. Even a cautious optimism about building a life with a man she was beginning to understand and respect. But joy seemed too strong a word for a marriage born of necessity rather than love. The ceremony itself was brief and practical, held on a crisp November morning with only a handful of witnesses present. Agnes had wanted something small and understated, partly to avoid drawing attention to the rushed timeline, but mostly because elaborate celebrations felt inappropriate for what was essentially a business arrangement. Flint stood at the altar, looking uncomfortable in his best suit, his massive frame making even the church's high ceiling seem inadequate. But when Agnes walked down the aisle, something in his expression shifted. The careful formality in his dark eyes gave way to something warmer, more genuine. "You look," he began when she reached his side, then stopped, apparently at a loss for words. "The dress fits well," Agnes replied practically, though she was blushing slightly at the admiration in his voice. Pastor Patterson cleared his throat and began the traditional words, speaking of love and honor and commitment until death parted them. When they reached the vows, Both Agnes and Flint spoke their promises with quiet sincerity, though neither met the other's eyes. "You may kiss the bride," the pastor announced, and for the first time, Agnes felt a flutter of real nervousness. They hadn't kissed since that night during the storm, hadn't touched beyond the occasional brush of fingers when he helped her from the wagon. Flint's hands were gentle as they framed her face, his touch as careful as if she were made of spun. Glass. When his lips met hers, the kiss was soft and respectful, lasting only a moment before he drew back. But it was enough to remind Agnes of the tenderness she'd glimpsed that stormy night, enough to make her wonder if perhaps this arrangement might become something more than mere convenience. The reception was held at the boarding house, where Mrs. Jenkins had prepared a simple meal for the small gathering. Agnes found herself studying her new husband as he accepted congratulations and best wishes from their neighbors. There was an awkwardness about him in social situations, a careful formality that suggested he was never quite comfortable being the center of attention. When they finally returned to the ranch, to what was now their shared home, the weight of their new reality settled between them like a physical presence. Agnes carried her small valise of belongings, looking around the main room with fresh eyes now that this was to be her permanent residence. "I've cleared space in the bedroom," Flint said, his voice carefully neutral. "The dresser and half the wardrobe are yours now. I can sleep in the barn if you'd prefer privacy while you're—" He gestured vaguely toward her still flat stomach. "That's not necessary," Agnes replied, though the thought of sharing a bed with this man she barely knew sent her pulse racing for reasons she didn't want to examine too closely. "We're married now. Married couples share bedrooms." The first few days of their marriage fell into an awkward rhythm of politeness and careful consideration. Flint rose before dawn to tend the animals, allowing Agnes privacy to dress and prepare breakfast. She cooked and cleaned with efficient competence, treating the domestic tasks as she might any other job requiring skill and attention to detail. In the evenings, they sat by the fire reading. She with her books of poetry and literature, he with farming journals and the Bible his mother had left him. Occasionally, one would comment on something interesting, leading to careful conversations that revealed more about their personalities and values. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Agnes first saw Flint carving. She'd noticed the wooden horses scattered around the house, small, beautifully detailed figures that captured the spirit of the animals with remarkable skill. But watching him create one was entirely different. "You're very talented," she observed, setting aside her book to watch his large hands shape the wood with delicate precision. "How long have you been carving?" "My mother taught me when I was small," Flint replied, not looking up from his work. "Said it would help me learn to be gentle with things, to use my hands for creating instead of just working." Agnes could see the truth of that philosophy in the way he handled the knife, in the patient care he took with each detail. "What made you choose horses?" "They were the first animals that weren't afraid of me," he said simply. "When I was a boy, some of the kids in town used to dare each other to get close to the giant. Made me feel like a monster sometimes. But horses, they don't care how big you are if you're gentle with them." The confession was quietly offered, without self-pity, but it gave Agnes new insight into the man she'd married. She could imagine him as a child, already towering over his peers, trying to find his place in a world that saw him as a curiosity rather than a person. "Children can be cruel," she said softly. "I've seen it in my classroom, the way they sometimes treat anyone who's different." "Did you ever feel different?" Flint asked, glancing up from his carving to meet her eyes. Agnes considered the question seriously. "Always," she admitted. "Too bookish for most of the girls my age, too interested in ideas instead of gossip. Even in my marriage to Robert, I sometimes felt like I was playing a role that didn't quite fit. And now, the question hung between them, weighted with implications about their current arrangement. Agnes met his gaze steadily, seeing something vulnerable in his dark eyes that encouraged honesty. "Now I feel like perhaps being different isn't such a terrible thing," she said, Perhaps it just means I needed to find someone who understood what it was like. Something shifted in Flint's expression, a subtle warming that made Agnes's heart skip. For a moment the careful formality between them cracked, revealing the possibility of something deeper. "I never thought I'd have a wife," he said quietly, his hands stilling on the carving. "Never thought any woman would want to share a life with someone like me. And I never thought I'd marry again," Agnes replied, "especially not under these circumstances." "But you're not sorry?" The question held a note of uncertainty that surprised her with its vulnerability. Agnes considered her answer carefully, looking around the simple but comfortable room that was now her home, at the man whose child she carried, at the life they were slowly building together from duty and necessity, and perhaps eventually something more. "No," she said finally. "I'm not sorry." The smile that spread across Flint's face was like sunrise after a long night, gradual, warming, transforming his stern features into something almost beautiful. For the first time since their hasty wedding, Agnes allowed herself to hope that perhaps this marriage of convenience might become something neither of them had dared to dream of. Outside, the wind whispered across the prairie, carrying the promise of winter and change and new beginnings that neither of them could yet imagine. The baby blanket was taking shape slowly under the combined efforts of Agnes and Flint's mother's old sewing circle, though Agnes had been surprised to discover that Sarah Rawley had been part of such a group. Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Collins, and 3 other women gathered every Tuesday afternoon at the church to work on the quilt, their needles flying while they shared gossip and wisdom in equal measure. "Sarah always said this town needed more babies," Mrs. Patterson observed carefully, stitching a corner piece that featured tiny horses galloping across blue fabric. "She'd be so pleased to know her son was finally starting a family." Agnes smoothed her hand over her growing belly. She was 5 months along now, and the pregnancy was becoming impossible to hide. The baby had started moving recently, gentle flutters that filled her with wonder and terror in equal measure. At 43, she'd assumed motherhood was beyond her reach, and now she found herself constantly amazed by the life growing inside her. "Has Flint said what he hopes for?" asked Mrs. Collins, whose own 6 children had kept her well versed in pregnancy and childbirth. "Boy or girl? He says he doesn't care, as long as the baby is healthy," Agnes replied, which was true. But she'd caught him carving smaller and smaller horses lately, pieces that looked suspiciously like toys, sized for small hands. The thought of her serious, gentle husband preparing gifts for their unborn child made her heart swell with unexpected emotion. The truth was, their marriage was evolving in ways that surprised them both. What had begun as a practical arrangement was slowly transforming into something deeper, though neither dared put a name to it yet. That evening, as Agnes prepared dinner, she heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, too many horses moving too fast. Through the kitchen window, she saw 3 men she didn't recognize riding hard toward the house, their faces grim and purposeful. Flint emerged from the barn at the sound, his massive frame tense with alertness. Agnes watched as he assessed the approaching riders, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle he kept near the door. "Rawley!" called the lead rider as they reined in their horses near the front porch. He was a lean man with cold eyes and a badge pinned to his vest. "We're looking for stolen cattle. Word is, you've been buying stock without asking too many questions about brands." Agnes felt her blood chill. Cattle rustling was a hanging offense in this territory, and false accusations had destroyed more than one honest rancher. She moved closer to the window, her hand protectively covering her belly. "All my cattle are legally purchased with bills of sale," Flint replied calmly, though Agnes could hear the steel beneath his quiet tone. "You're welcome to examine my records." "Records can be forged," sneered the second rider. "What we need is to check your herds, see if any of them are wearing brands that don't match your paperwork." Flint's jaw tightened, but he nodded toward the pastures. "Check whatever you need to check, but I'll be with you while you do it." As the men rode toward the grazing cattle, Agnes felt a knot of fear forming in her stomach. Something about this felt wrong. The timing, the aggressive attitude, the way they'd shown up just as other ranchers were starting to struggle with missing livestock. An hour later, the men returned with triumph written across their faces. Found. 3 head with the Morrison brand, the leader announced. Pete Morrison reported them stolen 2 weeks ago. That's impossible, Flint said, his voice deadly quiet. I haven't bought cattle from anyone in over a month. The evidence says otherwise, the man replied, pulling out a pair of iron shackles. Flint Rawley, you're under arrest for cattle theft. Agnes burst through the front door before anyone could stop her. This is ridiculous. My husband is an honest man. He wouldn't steal so much as a chicken. Ma'am, you need to step back, the deputy warned, but Agnes planted herself firmly between them and Flint. Those cattle were planted on our land, she said with fierce conviction. Anyone with half a brain can see this is a setup. Who's paying you to frame my husband? The lead man's face darkened. Careful, lady. Accusations like that can get you in trouble too. Agnes, Flint said quietly, his hand gentle on her shoulder. Go back in the house. I will not, she replied hotly. They can't just— Yes, they can, Flint interrupted, his voice resigned. At least until this gets sorted out in court. As they led Flint away in shackles, Agnes felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. She'd married this man, out of necessity, but watching him be falsely accused had awakened feelings she'd been trying to keep buried. This wasn't just about duty or respectability anymore. Someone was threatening the father of her child, the man who'd shown her such gentle kindness, and she wouldn't stand for it. The next morning, Agnes hitched up the wagon and drove straight to Pete Morrison's ranch. If cattle had been stolen from him and planted on their land, Pete needed to know what was really happening. She found the old rancher mending fence, his weathered face creased with worry. Agnes! I heard about Flint. I can't believe he'd steal. From me, we've been neighbors for 20 years. Because he didn't steal from you, Agnes said firmly. Pete, think about it. Who benefits if both you and Flint lose your ranches? Who's been sniffing around offering to buy land cheap? Pete's eyes widened as understanding dawned. That railroad company, they've been wanting to run tracks through this valley, but most of us won't sell. Exactly. And if they can frame them, largest ranchers for theft, force bankruptcy and foreclosure, they get the land for next to nothing, Pete finished grimly. Those cattle were stolen from me and planted on Flint's land to destroy both of us. Over the next 3 days, Agnes threw herself into gathering evidence with the same methodical determination she'd once applied to lesson plans. She rode from ranch to ranch, documenting which properties the railroad wanted most, which ranchers had been approached with lowball offers, which families had been hit by mysterious cattle thefts. The picture that emerged was clear. A systematic campaign to destabilize the local ranching community. Agnes compiled witness statements, financial records, and a timeline that showed the pattern of harassment targeting specific landowners, but it was Martha Collins who provided the breakthrough. I was in Cedar Falls last week, she told Agnes, as they sat in the makeshift clinic. Heard 2 men talking in the saloon about how easy it was to plant evidence when you had law enforcement in your pocket. They mentioned Flint by name. Agnes felt her pulse quicken. Did you recognize them? One was that deputy who arrested Flint. The other was a man in a fancy suit who said he represented railroad interests. That night, Agnes sat at her kitchen table writing a detailed letter to the territorial judge, documenting everything they'd discovered. Her pregnancy made her movements slower, more careful, but it also fueled her determination. She would not let her child grow up without a father because of corrupt men and false accusations. As she sealed the letter, she felt the baby kick strongly, as if in approval. Agnes smiled, placing both hands on her belly. Don't worry, little one, she whispered. We're going to bring your daddy home. Outside, the wind carried the scent of coming snow and the promise of a hard winter ahead. But inside the cabin, Agnes Rawley burned with the fierce protectiveness of a woman defending her family. a family she'd come to love more deeply than she'd ever thought possible. The gentle giant who carved wooden horses and spoke softly to frightened animals had become the center of her world, and she would move heaven and earth to prove his innocence and bring him home where he belonged. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a well-dressed courier who seemed oddly nervous for someone carrying what appeared to be simple correspondence. Agnes accepted the envelope with growing unease, noting the expensive stationery and the unfamiliar return address from a law firm in Chicago. Inside, the letterhead read, "Blackwood, Sterling and Associates," and the contents made Agnes's blood run cold. "Mrs. Agnes Rawley, it has come to our attention that you are currently expecting a child out of wedlock, having conceived said child through illicit relations with one Flint Rawley, a man of questionable character and reputation. Our clients, the estate of Robert Truelight, have legitimate concerns about the moral fitness of a woman who would engage in such scandalous behavior. As the deceased husband's family holds legal interest in any potential heirs, we hereby demand immediate custody of the unborn child upon birth. Furthermore, should you resist this reasonable request, we are prepared to expose your immoral conduct to the territorial authorities and pursue full legal action to protect the innocent child from your corrupting influence. You have 7 days to respond to this demand." Respectfully, Harrison Blackwood. Agnes sank into the nearest chair, the letter trembling in her hands. Robert's family, his cold, disapproving parents who had barely acknowledged her existence during their brief marriage. She hadn't heard from them in over 15 years, had assumed they'd forgotten she existed, but somehow they'd learned about her pregnancy. Worse, they somehow believed she was an unwed mother, despite her marriage to Flint. The letter made it clear they had no knowledge of her legal union, which meant whoever was feeding them information was deliberately withholding crucial facts. Second, more devastating realization hit her as she reread the document. The letter referred to any potential heirs of Robert Truelight. Her late husband's family had never had children. Robert had been their only heir. If they could claim her baby as Robert's posthumous child, they would control not only the infant, but also a substantial inheritance. The twisted logic made Agnes feel sick. They were claiming a child that couldn't possibly be Robert's. He'd been dead for over 15 years, but in the chaos of false accusations and legal maneuvering, truth might not matter as much as expensive lawyers and social pressure. Agnes forced herself to think clearly. The Truelights were wealthy, influential people with connections throughout the territory. They could afford the best legal representation and had the social standing to make their accusations stick, especially against a woman they could paint as morally compromised. But they were operating on false information. They didn't know about her marriage to Flint, which meant someone was deliberately feeding them incomplete facts. Someone who wanted to destroy her family and saw this as the perfect weapon. Agnes was still puzzling over these connections when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Through the window, she saw Mrs. Patterson climbing down from her buckboard, her usually cheerful face grim with concern. "Agnes, dear, I have troubling news," the pastor's wife began as soon as she entered the kitchen. "A man came to see my husband this morning, a lawyer from back east asking questions about you and Flint." "What kind of questions?" "About your moral character, your relationship before marriage, whether the baby might not be Flint's." Mrs. Patterson's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Of course my husband told him that you're a respectable married woman, but this lawyer seemed to think you were never properly wed." Agnes felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "What did this lawyer look like?" "Thin man, well-dressed with cold eyes. He had papers with him, said he represented the Truelight family from Chicago." "The Truelight family," Agnes repeated slowly. "Mrs. Patterson, did you tell him when Flint and I were married?" "Well, yes, of course. November 15th, just a few weeks ago." "Why?" A chill ran down Agnes's spine. If the lawyer had been asking questions after the wedding, he knew perfectly well that she was legally married. which meant the letter threatening to expose her as an unwed mother was deliberately false, a calculated lie designed to frighten her into submission. "Mrs. Patterson," Agnes said carefully, "I need you to think very hard about this. Did the lawyer seem surprised when you told him about the wedding?" The older woman frowned, considering. "Now that you mention it, he did seem taken aback, asked me to repeat the date several times, wanted to know if I was certain. Then he asked some very inappropriate questions about whether the marriage was legitimate or just a hasty arrangement to cover scandal." Agnes felt anger building in her chest, not just at the Truelights, but at whoever was orchestrating this attack on her family. The same people who had framed Flint for cattle theft were now using her late husband's family as unwitting weapons in their campaign of destruction. "There's something else," Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "After the lawyer left, I saw him talking to that deputy who arrested Flint. They seemed very friendly for strangers." The final piece fell into place. The railroad company wasn't just content to frame Flint for theft. They wanted to destroy Agnes as well, to leave their unborn child orphaned and vulnerable. By feeding false information to Robert's family, they'd created a legal nightmare that could drag on for months while Flint rotted in jail and Agnes lost everything she'd built. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated her. Agnes spent the rest of the day crafting a careful response to the Truelight lawyers. Instead of the frightened submission they clearly expected, she wrote with cool precision, laying out the facts they'd apparently been denied. "Mr. Blackwood, I am in receipt of your letter dated November 20th, and I must correct several significant errors in your information. First, I am not an unwed mother. I'm legally married to Mr. Flint Rawley as of November 15th, 1884. In a ceremony performed by Pastor Patterson of the Dry Creek Community Church. Witnesses included Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Pete Morrison, and Mrs. Martha Collins. Second, the child I carry is undoubtedly that of my current husband, conceived within the bounds of our relationship and born of our legal union. Third, any claims your clients might have to this child are not only legally baseless, but morally reprehensible, as they concern a child who has no blood relation to the Truelight family. I can only assume that your clients have been deliberately misinformed about my circumstances by parties unknown. I suggest you verify your facts before proceeding with any further legal action that could result in serious professional embarrassment. I remain confident that when the full truth comes to light, your clients will realize they have been manipulated by individuals with their own agenda. Respectfully, Mrs. Agnes Rawley. As she sealed the letter, Agnes felt a fierce satisfaction. Let the Truelights try to explain to a judge why they were claiming rights to a child that couldn't possibly be their heir. Let them investigate their sources and discover they'd been used as pawns in someone else's scheme. But even as she felt the momentary triumph of fighting back, Agnes knew the real battle was just beginning. The people behind this conspiracy had resources, connections, and apparently no scruples about destroying innocent lives to achieve their goals. She placed her hand protectively over her growing belly, feeling the baby's strong movements beneath her palm. This child would be born into a world where powerful men tried to steal ranches and manipulate the law for profit, where corruption could turn neighbors against each other and tear families apart. But this child would also be born to parents who had learned to fight for what mattered, who had discovered that love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances, and who would move heaven and earth to protect their family. Agnes looked around the simple cabin that had become her home, at the wooden horses Flint had carved, at the baby blanket the sewing circle was creating with such care and hope. These people, this place, this life they were building together, it was worth fighting for, and fight she would, with every weapon at her disposal, until her husband was free and their child was safe from those who would use an innocent baby as a pawn in their greedy schemes. The war for their family had begun, but Agnes Rawley was no longer the quiet, compliant schoolteacher who had arrived in Dry Creek all those years ago. She was a wife, a soon-to-be mother, and a woman who had finally found something worth fighting for with everything she had. Sheriff Hawkins arrived at the ranch 3 days later, his weathered face grave as he dismounted from his horse. Agnes had been expecting him. Word traveled fast in small communities, and she knew her letter to the territorial judge would have prompted official action. The sheriff's badge caught the morning sunlight as he approached the house, and Agnes found herself thinking about justice and law, about the difference between what was legal and what was right. That badge was supposed to represent protection for honest citizens, but lately it seemed like the law was a weapon being used against people like Flint. "Mrs. Rawley," Sheriff Hawkins said, touching his hat brim respectfully, "I need to speak with you about your husband's case. May I come in?" Agnes nodded, leading him into the kitchen where she poured coffee and tried to read his expression. Sheriff Hawkins was a fair man, but he was also cautious, not the type to make bold moves without solid evidence. "I received a very interesting report from Judge Morrison," he began, setting down his cup. "Seems you've been doing some investigating of your own." "Someone needed to," Agnes replied firmly. "My husband is innocent, and I won't sit by while corrupt men destroy our family." "Your evidence is compelling," the sheriff admitted. "The pattern you've documented, the railroad company, the targeted ranches, the planted cattle, it paints a clear picture of conspiracy." Agnes felt a flicker of hope. "Then you'll release Flint?" "It's not that simple," Sheriff Hawkins sighed, suddenly looking older than his years. "The evidence against your husband is still substantial. Those cattle were found on his land, wearing Morrison's brand. Even if we suspect they were planted, proving it in court is another matter entirely. But surely the judge can see that we have a complex situation with accusations." "Flying in all directions," the sheriff interrupted gently. "What we need is concrete proof of who's behind this conspiracy. Names, documents, witnesses who can testify to specific crimes." Agnes felt her frustration building. "And while we're gathering that proof, my husband sits in jail, and my family falls apart?" "There's more," Sheriff Hawkins continued, his expression growing even more serious. "I've received word that the territorial court is being pressured to move up your husband's trial. Someone wants this resolved quickly, before too many questions can be asked." The implications hit Agnes like a physical blow. A rushed trial would favor the prosecution, leaving little time to gather evidence or mount a proper defense. It would also prevent the railroad conspiracy from being properly investigated. "How long do we have?" 2 weeks, maybe less. Agnes felt the baby kick hard, as if responding to her stress. 2 weeks to prove Flint's innocence, expose a complex conspiracy, and protect their unborn child from being stolen by her late husband's family. It seemed impossible. "Sheriff," she said slowly, "what if I could get you proof, real evidence of who's behind this?" Hawkins studied her carefully. "What kind of proof?" "The kind that involves considerable risk," Agnes admitted. "But the kind that would end this once and for all." That evening, Agnes sat at her kitchen table with Pete Morrison, Martha Collins, and Pastor Patterson, planning what might charitably be called an investigation, and more accurately described as a dangerous gamble. "The way I see it," Pete said, studying the map Agnes had drawn of the valley, "if the railroad company is behind this, they're operating out of that camp they set up near Cedar Falls. That's where they're keeping their records, their correspondence, their evidence of bribes and planted evidence. It's also where they're keeping armed guards and men who've already proven they're willing to break the law," Pastor Patterson pointed out. "Agnes, what you're suggesting is incredibly dangerous, especially in your condition." Agnes placed her hand protectively over her belly, now 7 months rounded with pregnancy. The baby was active and strong, but carrying this child while attempting something so risky seemed almost foolhardy. Yet what choice did she have? "If I don't act now, my child will be born into a world where his father is branded a criminal and his mother is fighting a legal battle she can't win," she said quietly. "I won't let that happen. Martha reached across the table to cover Agnes's hand with her own. "You won't be doing this alone. We're all in this together. The whole community is behind you. But I'm the only one who can get close enough to their operation without arousing suspicion," Agnes pointed out. "A pregnant woman seeking medical help. They won't see me as a threat." The plan they devised was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Agnes would travel to Cedar Falls under the pretense of seeking specialized medical care for her pregnancy. The railroad camp was located just outside town, and their makeshift headquarters was poorly guarded during daylight hours, when most of the men were working on survey operations. "You'll need to find documentary evidence," Sheriff Hawkins had told her privately. "Letters, telegrams, payment records, something that directly links the railroad company to the cattle thefts and false accusations. Without that, even the most compelling testimony won't be enough to clear Flint's name." The morning of her departure, Agnes felt the weight of what she was attempting settle over her like a heavy cloak. She was risking not only her own life, but the life of her unborn child, gambling everything on a desperate plan that might not even work. As she prepared to leave, Agnes found herself thinking about the wooden horse Flint carried, the one he'd carved as a child, representing his mother's belief that his hands were meant to create rather than destroy. She thought about the gentle way he spoke to frightened animals, the careful precision with which he'd repaired her schoolhouse roof, the vulnerability in his eyes when he'd spoken of feeling like a monster. This man, her husband, the father of her child, was worth the risk. Their family was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The ride to Cedar Falls took most of the day, and by the time Agnes reached the outskirts of town, her back was aching and the baby was restless. She'd arranged to stay with Mrs. Chen, a Chinese herbalist who provided medical care to women in the area. It was a perfect cover story, a pregnant woman seeking traditional remedies and guidance from an experienced midwife. Mrs. Chen welcomed her warmly, immediately fussing over her comfort and the baby's position. "You are very brave to travel so far in your condition," she said as she prepared tea. "Most women would stay close to home at this stage." "I had to come," Agnes replied, which was certainly true. "There are some things more important than personal comfort." That evening, as she sat in Mrs. Chen's small parlor planning her next move, Agnes felt the baby's strong kicks and wondered if the child could sense the danger they were in. Tomorrow, she would attempt to infiltrate the railroad camp and steal evidence that could save Flint's life, or get them both killed in the process. She thought about the letter from the True Light lawyers, now crumpled and thrown away, but still haunting her thoughts. Even if she succeeded in proving Flint's innocence, that legal battle still loomed. Robert's family had resources and connections that could drag the fight through courts for years. But first things first. Tomorrow she would either find the evidence needed to free her husband, or she would discover that some battles couldn't be won through courage and determination alone. Agnes placed both hands on her belly, feeling the strong, steady movements of the child who would soon enter this complicated, dangerous world. "Hold on, little one," she whispered. "Tomorrow we fight for your daddy's freedom. Tomorrow we fight for our family's future." Outside, the wind carried the scent of approaching winter and the distant sound of railroad construction, the sound of progress that was crushing everything in its path. But inside the small room, a pregnant woman planned her own small rebellion against the forces that would destroy her family. The final battle was about to begin, and Agnes Rawley was as ready as she'd ever be to fight for everything that mattered. The pains started just before dawn, sharp and regular, cutting through Agnes's sleep like knife blades. She gasped, clutching her swollen belly as another contraction gripped her, and realized with growing panic that the baby was coming, now 6 weeks early, in a strange house miles from home. "Mrs. Chen!" she called out, her voice tight with pain and fear. "Something's wrong!" The herbalist appeared within moments, her experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation. "Baby is ready," she said calmly, though Agnes caught the flash. of concern in her expression. Too early, but babies choose their own time. Another contraction seized Agnes, stronger than the last, and she couldn't suppress a cry of pain. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. The baby wasn't due for weeks yet, and Flint was locked in a jail cell 20 miles away, unable to even know that his child was fighting to enter the world. "Can you stop it?" Agnes gasped between contractions. "Can you make it wait?" Mrs. Chen shook her head, already gathering supplies. "Baby decides when to come. We help make safe journey into world." As the labor progressed with frightening intensity, Agnes found herself thinking about birth certificates, the official documents that would determine her child's fate. Would the baby be listed as legitimate? Would the True Light family try to claim this early arrival as proof that the child had been conceived before her marriage to Flint? "Focus on breathing," Mrs. Chen instructed, her hands gentle but firm as she helped Agnes through another contraction. Baby needs mother to be strong, but Agnes felt anything but strong. At 43, giving birth for the first time, with her husband imprisoned and enemies circling like vultures, she felt overwhelmed by the enormity of bringing a life into such chaos. What kind of world was she delivering this child into? Hours passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. Mrs. Chen worked with quiet efficiency, using herbs and techniques passed down through generations. But Agnes could see the worry growing in her eyes. The baby was small, arriving too early, and the birth was not progressing as smoothly as either of them had hoped. "Something wrong?" Agnes managed to ask during a brief respite between contractions. "Baby is very small," Mrs. Chen admitted. "Born too soon. We must be very careful." As if summoned by their conversation, the final contractions began with overwhelming force. Agnes gripped Mrs. Chen's hands, pouring every ounce of her strength into bringing her child safely into the world. She thought of Flint's gentle hands, carving wooden horses, of his patient voice calming frightened animals, of the vulnerability in his eyes when he'd spoken about feeling like a monster. "Come on, little one," she whispered through gritted teeth. "Your daddy is waiting to meet you." With a final surge of effort that left Agnes gasping and shaking, the baby slipped into Mrs. Chen's waiting hands, tiny, wrinkled, and ominously silent. "Why isn't the baby crying?" Agnes asked, panic rising in her voice as she struggled to sit up. "Mrs. Chen, why?" The herbalist was working quickly, clearing the infant's airways and rubbing the tiny chest with practiced movements. The baby was so small, so fragile, that Agnes could hardly believe this delicate creature had been growing inside her for months. Then, finally, a thin wail pierced the air, weak, but unmistakably alive. "Daughter," Mrs. Chen announced with relief, carefully cleaning the infant before placing her on Agnes's chest. "Very small, but breathing good. Fighter, like mother." Agnes looked down at her daughter, and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it took her breath away. The baby was indeed tiny, her skin wrinkled and translucent, but her eyes were bright and alert, and her tiny fists waved with surprising strength. "Hello, little fighter," Agnes whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mama." The baby's eyes seemed to focus on Agnes's face, and for a moment the chaos of the outside world faded away. Here was what mattered. This tiny life that depended on her completely, this innocent child who deserved a chance to grow up safe and loved. But even as Agnes marveled at her daughter's perfect tiny features, reality came crashing back, outside. This room. Flint still sat in a jail cell, facing trial for crimes he didn't commit. The railroad conspiracy continued to destroy families and steal land. The True Light lawyers were still plotting to take this precious child away from her parents. "Mrs. Chen," Agnes said quietly, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to register this birth with the authorities in Cedar Falls, but I need the paperwork to show that she was born exactly 7 months after my marriage date." The herbalist studied her carefully. "You ask me to lie on official documents. ask you to protect an innocent child from people who would use her as a weapon," Agnes replied, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "This baby is Flint Rawley's daughter, born of our legal marriage, but there are those who would twist the timing to suit their own purposes." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "I understand. Some truths are more important than exact dates." As Agnes held her tiny daughter close, feeling the baby's warm breath against her neck, she knew that everything had changed. The stakes were no longer just about clearing Flint's name or protecting their property. Now she was fighting for this innocent life, for the right to raise her child in peace and safety. The birth certificate Mrs. Chen would file would show the baby as legitimate, born to married parents, protected by law. But Agnes knew that the real battle for her daughter's future was just beginning. The courthouse in Cedar Falls had never hosted such a dramatic hearing. Word had spread throughout the territory about the railroad conspiracy, and farmers and ranchers traveled for days to witness what many saw as a test of whether honest citizens could still find justice in a system increasingly controlled by corporate interests. Agnes sat in the front row, her week-old daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, while Flint stood at the defendant's table, looking thin but determined after his weeks in jail. The sight of his wife and child gave him strength, though Agnes could see the worry in his eyes every time he looked at their tiny daughter. Judge Morrison, no relation to their neighbor Pete, was known throughout the territory as a fair but stern man who had little patience for courtroom theatrics. He'd postponed the original trial date when Agnes's evidence began surfacing, much to the prosecution's obvious displeasure. "This court will come to order," the judge announced, his voice carrying easily through the packed courtroom. "We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of Flint Rawley in the matter of cattle theft, but it appears we must also examine allegations of a broader conspiracy." The prosecution presented their case first: the stolen cattle found on Flint's land, the brands clearly showing Morrison ownership, the lack of any bill of sale for the animals in question. It was straightforward and seemingly damning evidence that would have convicted any man under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. When Sheriff Hawkins took the stand, he presented Agnes's meticulously documented evidence of the railroad conspiracy. The pattern of targeted ranches, the timeline of cattle thefts coinciding with land acquisition attempts, the connection between corrupt deputies and railroad representatives. "Your Honor," the sheriff testified, "Mrs. Rawley's investigation has uncovered what appears to be a systematic campaign to drive honest ranchers off their land through false accusations and planted evidence." The prosecution objected vigorously, but Judge Morrison allowed the testimony to continue. Then came the moment Agnes had been waiting for and dreading. Mrs. Chen took the stand, carrying a small bundle of papers. In her careful English, she testified about Agnes's arrival in Cedar Falls, about the early birth of the baby, and about a conversation she'd overheard between two men discussing the railroad's operations. "Two men came to my shop day before baby born," she testified. "They speak of how easy to move cattle at night, how corrupt deputy helps plant evidence. They mention Flint Rawley by name, laugh about how giant man will hang for crimes he not commit." The defense attorney produced Mrs. Chen's detailed notes about the conversation, including names and specific details that corroborated Agnes's investigation. But it was the next witness who delivered the crushing blow to the prosecution's case. Deputy Miller, the same man who had arrested Flint, walked into the courtroom in shackles, his face pale and defeated. Sheriff Hawkins had arrested him the previous day, based on evidence Agnes had provided. "State your name and occupation," the defense attorney instructed. "Thomas Miller, former deputy sheriff," he replied, his voice barely audible. "Former deputy. I was arrested yesterday for taking bribes and planting evidence." A murmur ran through the courtroom, and Judge Morrison gavelled. For silence, under oath, Miller confessed to the entire conspiracy. The railroad company had paid him to steal cattle from targeted ranchers and plant them on the property of those who refused to sell their land. Flint Rawley had been specifically targeted because his ranch sat on the most direct route for the proposed rail line. How many ranchers were framed in this scheme? The defense attorney asked. 6, including Rawley. Maybe more that I don't know about. And who coordinated these operations? Miller glanced nervously at the back of the courtroom, where several well-dressed men sat with grim expressions. Railroad company executives. They paid good money to clear the right-of-way by any means necessary. The prosecution tried to salvage their case by arguing that Miller's testimony was unreliable, that a corrupt deputy might say anything to reduce his own sentence. But the evidence was overwhelming. Documents Agnes had helped recover, witness statements from multiple sources, and a paper trail that clearly showed the railroad company's involvement. When the defense called Agnes to testify, she walked to the stand with her baby still in her arms, drawing sympathetic murmurs from the gallery. Mrs. Rawley, the defense attorney began, what motivated you to investigate your husband's case so thoroughly? Agnes looked across the courtroom at Flint, drawing strength from his encouraging nod. I knew my husband was innocent, she said. Simply, Flint Rawley is the most honest man I've ever known. He would never steal from a neighbor, never harm another person's livelihood. When I saw him being framed for crimes he didn't commit, I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Tell us about the evidence you gathered. Agnes spoke clearly and methodically, describing her investigation, the patterns she'd discovered, the connections between the railroad company and the planted evidence. She presented her marriage certificate as evidence that she was a credible witness, not some desperate woman trying to save a lover. But it was when the prosecution cross-examined her that the full drama unfolded. Mrs. Rawley, the prosecutor, said with a sneer, isn't it true that you have your own motivations for protecting Mr. Rawley? That this marriage was hastily arranged to cover a scandalous pregnancy? Agnes felt the baby stir in her arms and drew strength from the tiny life she held. My marriage to Flint Rawley was legal and proper, witnessed by respectable members of our community. Our daughter was born 7 months after our wedding, exactly as one would expect. The prosecutor consulted his notes, clearly expecting a different answer. 7 months? But according to information we received— According to what information? Agnes interrupted, her voice growing stronger. From what source? Perhaps the same sources that provided false evidence about stolen cattle. Judge Morrison leaned forward, with interest. Counselor, do you have documented evidence to support these allegations about Mrs. Rawley's marriage? The prosecutor fumbled through his papers, clearly flustered. Your Honor, we received correspondence from the Truelight family. Lawyers claiming the same Truelight family that your clients fed false information to. Agnes interjected. The same lawyers who were told I was an unwed mother when I was, in fact, legally married. Perhaps this court should examine who benefits from spreading such lies. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Not only had the railroad company framed innocent ranchers for theft, they had also attempted to manipulate other legal proceedings to destroy their targets' families. When the prosecutor tried to recover by questioning the timing of the marriage, Sheriff Hawkins stood up in the gallery. Your Honor, I can testify that Flint Rawley and Agnes Truelight were married on November 15th in a proper ceremony witnessed by multiple community members. The suggestion that this was anything other than a legitimate union is not only false, but insulting to two of the most respectable citizens in our territory. Judge Morrison had heard enough. The court finds the evidence of conspiracy overwhelming and the charges against Mr. Rawley to be based on fabricated evidence. Flint Rawley, you are hereby cleared of all charges and released immediately. The courtroom exploded in cheers as Flint was freed from his shackles. He moved quickly to Agnes's side, his massive frame trembling as he gathered his wife and daughter into his arms for the first time. Is the baby, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he looked down at his tiny daughter. She's perfect, Agnes replied, tears streaming down her face. Meet your daughter, Flint. Meet Sarah, named for your mother. As Flint carefully took his daughter in his massive hands, the baby's eyes opened and seemed to focus on his face. A look of wonder crossed his features as he realized that this tiny, perfect creature was his family, his legacy, his future. "Hello, little Sarah," he whispered, his deep voice gentle as a lullaby. "I'm your daddy, and I promise I'll never let anyone hurt you." In the chaos of celebration and congratulations that followed, Agnes watched her husband with their daughter and felt her heart swell with pride and love. They had faced conspiracy, false accusations, and attempts to steal their child, but they had emerged stronger, united, and victorious. The railroad executives slipped quietly out of the courtroom, their scheme exposed, and their careers likely ruined. Deputy Miller was led away to face justice for his crimes, and the True Light family lawyers found themselves explaining to very angry clients how they had been manipulated into pursuing baseless legal action. But for Agnes and Flint, none of that mattered now. They had their daughter, they had each other, and they had proven that love and determination could triumph over corruption and greed. Justice had been served. But more importantly, their family was finally complete and safe. 6 months later, the Rawley Ranch had transformed into something neither Agnes nor Flint had dared to imagine when they'd first married, out of duty and necessity. The spring morning air carried the sound of Sarah's delighted giggles as Flint held her up to see the new foals in the pasture, her tiny hands reaching toward the young horses with fearless curiosity. "She's going to be a handful," Agnes observed, watching from the porch where she sat with her growing belly. Their second child, conceived in love rather than accident, was due in the fall. "Look how she responds to the animals. She has your gift with them." Flint's face lit up with pride as Sarah babbled happily at the horses, who seemed equally enchanted with the tiny human. At 6 months old, she was small, but fierce, having inherited her mother's determination along with her father's gentle nature. "Hard to believe she started life so early and scared us all," Flint said, settling beside Agnes on the porch with Sarah in his arms. "Now look at her, strong as a little bull and twice as stubborn." Agnes smiled, remembering those terrifying first weeks when Sarah had been so tiny and fragile. Mrs. Chen had stayed with them for a month, teaching Agnes how to care for a premature infant, but Sarah had thrived from the beginning. Perhaps, Agnes thought, the baby had simply been eager to meet the father who'd been carving wooden horses for her since before she was born. The ranch had prospered too, beyond what either of them had expected. Word of their victory against the railroad conspiracy had spread throughout the territory, bringing new respect and business opportunities. Flint had been able to expand the herd and hire 2 hands to help with the work, allowing him more time with his growing family. "Pete Morrison stopped by yesterday while you were in town," Flint mentioned, shifting Sarah to his shoulder, where she promptly grabbed a handful of his dark hair. "The territorial governor wants to appoint me to a commission investigating railroad impractices. Apparently our case opened up a lot of other complaints." Agnes felt a familiar surge of pride in her husband's integrity. "Will you accept?" "If you think I should, it would mean travel, time away from the ranch and family." "I think," Agnes said carefully, "that some things are more important than just our own comfort. If you can help prevent other families from going through what we did, then perhaps it's worth the sacrifice." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the rolling prairie. In the distance, Agnes could see the abandoned railroad camp near Cedar Falls, a monument to corporate greed brought low by community solidarity and the determination of people who refused to be intimidated. "Agnes," Flint said quietly, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you." She looked at him curiously, noting the slight nervousness in his voice. "That first night during the storm, I need you to know that I didn't plan what happened between us. I never meant to take advantage." Flint, Agnes interrupted gently. I know that. I was there too, remember? We were both vulnerable. Both. Lonely. Neither of us planned it, but I don't regret it. Even though it complicated everything, even though it led to all the trouble with the conspiracy and the legal battles, Agnes considered the question seriously. Without that night, she would never have known the depth of love she was capable of feeling. Sarah wouldn't exist, their marriage would never have happened, and she would still be the lonely schoolteacher who'd convinced herself that books and lessons were enough to fill a life, especially because it led to all that, she said finally. Flint, before I married you, I thought I understood what love was. I thought what I'd felt for Robert was the deepest emotion I'd ever experience. But this, she gestured between them, encompassing their shared struggles, their daughter, the life they'd built together. This is something I never knew existed. Flint set Sarah gently in her basket, where she immediately began chewing on one of his carved wooden horses, then took Agnes's hands in his much larger ones. I love you, he said simply, the words carrying the weight of everything they'd been through together. Not because you're my wife or the mother of my children, but because you're the bravest, strongest, most wonderful woman I've ever known. You saw something in me that no one else ever had. Not the giant everyone was afraid of, but just a man who needed someone to love. And I love you, Agnes replied, tears threatening to spill over. For your gentleness with frightened animals and tiny babies, for your integrity that couldn't be bought or broken, for the way you make me feel beautiful even when I'm round as a barrel with your child. They kissed then, soft and sweet, with the prairie wind carrying the scent of wildflowers and new grass around them. In her basket, Sarah made contented noises as she explored her wooden toy, while inside Agnes, their second child, moved as if responding to the love surrounding them. All. Later that evening, as they prepared for bed, Agnes opened the family Bible that had belonged to Flint's mother. On the page reserved for family records, she carefully entered Sarah's birth information in her neat script, then paused before adding a second entry. Expected October 1885. Baby Rawley. Planning ahead? Flint asked, watching over her shoulder. Hoping. Ahead, Agnes corrected. This baby will be born into a world where their parents love each other, where their family is secure, where justice exists for people willing to fight for it. Flint nodded, thinking of the commission appointment, of the ongoing efforts to reform territorial law, of the community they'd helped forge through their struggles. Our children will know they're wanted, he said quietly. They'll never wonder. If their father loves them, never feel like they don't belong. Agnes closed the Bible and turned to her husband, seeing in his face the man who'd carved wooden horses for an unborn child, who'd faced false accusations with dignity, who'd become the father he'd never had. Come to bed, she said softly. Tomorrow, we start planning for our son or daughter's arrival, but tonight, let's just be grateful for what we have. As they settled into sleep, with Sarah breathing peacefully in her cradle nearby, Agnes reflected on the journey that had brought them. Here, what had begun as the loneliest people in a small town, finding unexpected love, had become something much larger, a testament to the power of fighting for what matters, of building families not just through blood, but through choice and commitment, and daily acts of love. Outside, the prairie wind whispered across the grassland, carrying with it the promise of harvest and new beginnings and the endless possibility that comes to those brave enough to love, pass their fears, and build lives worth fighting for.